Thank you everyone for coming. First, I'd just like to give a round of applause to Michael Hawley, who's done an amazing job. Thank you, Michael. I don't think we, thank him enough for everything he's done. And just to highlight everyone he's brought in here, so Hugh Johnson, who's right there, Shauna Singh Baldwin, who's there, Ali Kazmi, who's sitting here. These are giants. Doris, who's here, Sequinder and Anne. These are giants in the field, so I'm humbled to be amongst these people. Thank you so much. So I am going to read poetry, not just from me, but mostly from Kuldeep Gill, celebrating and sharing Sikh women's narratives through poetry. This is Kuldeep Gill's book, just in case you haven't seen it. I came willing to act like a Punjabi Sikh village daughter, as well as I could. But what must I do to belong in this place, here and now? Perhaps grow out my hair, wear a salwar kameez, laugh less loud, change my walk, dress an adornment, count, learn the ways, stay at home, cook, and become a Maliman, and all of that. And what about the Kannada side? We came, crossed the Kalipani, the men brought their wives. If they raise their children there, who will inherit the Indian Janeen? Is Kannada a homeland, the children's this? I opened this presentation with Kuldeep Gill's poem, Homelands, India, 1972, from her first collection of poetry, Dharam Raza. In these two stanzas, Gill questions how the location of two homelands, India and Kannada, or Canada, has contributed to gender construction and cultural traditions. The word choice is imperative here. Gill understands that in order for the narrator to be included in the Indian family, she has to be willing to act as a Punjabi Sikh village daughter, which causes her an inner conflict. The daughter has tried as well as she could to act according to her location, but she simply cannot change her walk to become part of the Indian community. In Gill's collection of poetry, I read for this duality that is embodied within these lines. When I read Gill's work, I'm in a very small way learning and expanding my own knowledge about my own background. Post-colonial theorist Dr. Arun Mukherjee believes that all learning must start with learning about one's own background. It must not stop there, but go on to include one fellow's beings in enlarging eccentric circles, beginning with communities that comprise the Canadian nation-state and to the rest of the world. If these concentric circles are to happen in our learning, we must have a broader historical understanding of these texts that incorporate South Asian religions and cultures within Canada, and these texts must become integral components to the Canadian literary experience. Sikh women are at the margins of their religious and cultural traditions, and there's no doubt that they have participated in the building of Canadian Sikh communities, but the question remains as to how their voices, stories, and lives have been articulated, transmitted, and accepted. Kuldeep Gill embraces cultural and religious traditions in her poetry, Dharam Raza, and in Valley Sutra, which was published in 2009. And it's through her work that we begin to understand the early struggles of Sikh Punjabi women in Canada. Gill's collection addresses Sikh women's marginalized subject position, which are the wife, the mother, the girl child, and the first generation of Indian Punjabi women in Canada. By recognizing the difficulties of reading Gill's text within this historical frame of white settler nationhood, what becomes apparent is how South Asian women have been historically silenced within the field of Canadian literature and within their communities. Let me introduce Kuldeep Gill a little bit. Kuldeep Gill was born in 1934 in Punjab, India. She immigrated to Canada when she was 5 years old with her mother, Balwant Kaur Gill, and her brother. They boarded a passenger ship, the Empress of Japan, and arrived in Vancouver in 1939. Her father, Indra Singh Gill, was already working in the lumber mills, and she was raised in the Fraser Valley, where she worked in the forest and mining industry for 20 years. She received a undergraduate and graduate degree in social anthropology from the University of British Columbia, and she completed a Master of Fine Arts. Her master's thesis, entitled A Canadian Sikh Wedding as Cultural Performance, Her master thesis was entitled A Canadian Sikh Wedding as Cultural Performance, and was one of the first detailed ethnographies of Sikh women's lives in BC. Gill was a trained anthropologist, and she was well aware that, quote, Sikh women have been depicted as almost perpetually subordinate, their roles underplayed, end quote. Gill was determined to write women's lives in her poetry and within her academic work. I first met Kuldeep in 2000 when she was on tour with her first book, which won the British Columbia Book Award the following year. I was late to her appearance at the local bookstore, and when I arrived, Gill was already reading from her poem Homeland, India in 1972. And just a funny story how I ended up at that bookstore. I actually snuck out of Gurdwara to go to the reading because it was on the same night. And as I was sneaking out, I thought, I'm gonna get caught somehow. But thank God there was no cell phones or pictures or anything like that during that time. So in 2000, so that tells you a little bit about, historical frame, or my historical frame. So I snuck out, didn't get caught, went back to the Gurdwara for 9 o'clock, but I was mesmerized by Kuldeep Gill because it was the first time that I had heard Sikh women talking about these issues. I felt moved and connected to her voice, and her voice has never left me. Kuldeep Gill passed away in May 2009 in Abbotsford. It was with her death that made me consider and reconsider the value of her contributions to not just Sikh studies, but to Canadian literature. In the following close reading, I will focus on a few poems from Dharmraza, where Gill skillfully weaves in her own family history, with a focus on her mother and women in her community. The book is structured into 2 parts. Part 1 is inspired by Raza theory, which is part of an Indian genre theory and Sanskrit poetics, describes an elaborate typography of 9 basic emotions. And part 2 is Kuldeep Ke Divan Ghazals, which is a series of ghazals in the second part. In reading Gill's notes on the text, we learn a short history of her family's travels between India and Canada. In providing her readers with the family history, she highlights how women in India lived and how moving to Canada was difficult and a lonely life for her mother and herself. Many of these poems were inspired by, many of these poems were inspired by stories told by my parents and by other family members. Some were written after reading letters that my father had written to my mother in India, which she carried back to Canada. In 1913, when my grandfather came to Canada, there were few Sikh families in BC. He brought his youngest son, my father, and 4 of his nephews to Canada. In 1939, my mother, brother, and I came to Canada to join my father and grandfather. Within 2 years of arriving in Queensborough, my family moved to Mission, where we were the first Sikh family in the town. My mother spoke no English. She came from a culture where women of the same clan lived together in large families, all generations under one roof. Here we were alone. A few Sikh men also lived in Mission, and one family lived in a farm near Desroches. Few Sikhs today know what it was like to live in Canada in the early years of immigration and through World War II. Some of these poems are our stories, written as poetry. Gill introduces herself as a Punjabi Sikh, and she links her religious identity with her national identities of India and Canada. Her poems address the immigrant's memory of coming to Canada from India. Gill is inspired by her mother in the poem Traveling Through the Borderlands. She writes, "Immigration officials wouldn't let us go aboard the CPR Empress lines. Quarantined a whole long month in Hong Kong. With sty-burned eyes, I held my mother's hand tightly, looked and listened as the sounds burned. We stayed in the Hong Kong Sikh temple. In the morning, a policeman standing on a pedestal whistled at rickshaws, cars, cycles, and people. I wonder how my mother survived without English. illiterate, 23, carrying an infant boy, a 4.5-year-old girl, across oceans, month-long quarantines, continents, head tax, third-class holds, immigration rules. She brought a granite grinding pestle to make masala, 2 saris, a cut velvet jacket, a dress, and for her neck, a hammered gold necklace to take to Vancouver. When she writes that her mother survived without English, it is a reminder of how these women came to Canada with very little education during this time period. In the 3rd stanza, in the first line, we stayed in the Hong Kong Sikh temple. I read for what is not within these poems, within this poem. In this poem, her mother is able to tap into a communal space based on religion within Hong Kong. However, in an interview with Gill, she stated that her mother did not want to discuss what happened in Hong Kong, and Gill was forever haunted by the images. Her mother did her best to survive, and we read for the mother's frustrations of travel without knowing English and with 2 small children at her side. At the heart of this poem are all the mothers, sisters, wives who travel across the continent to build a life in Canada. When I read Gill's poetry, she fills in the gap and reminds us that women of color have had to struggle for equality within racialized societies, and women have had to locate themselves, quote, in a particular history, the history of post-colonial white settler formation, end quote. I read how Gill is not only locating herself, but is also locating her mother and other women of color in this history. Gill focuses on her parents and the sacrifices that her parents and other South Asian families have made in order to become part of the nation. In the final 3 sections of Dharam Raza, we see a clear emergence of a Sikh Punjabi woman diasporic identity of forming. Here I'm reminded of Dr. Barar's quote, multiple journeys may configure into one journey via a confluence of narratives, as it is lived and relived, produced and reproduced, and transformed through individuals as well as a collective memory and rememory, end quote. In Gill's poetry, she's writing in this confluence of narratives based on her own memory as well as the collective history or historical memory of Sikh women, and by doing so, a diasporic identity is being sketched out and outlined. Gill weaves in Sikh women's religious marginalized subject position in her second poem, My Mother's India in Queensborough's Kitchen. The daughter watches her mother from a distance. Gill captures the omnipresent voices of young girls, a young girl who's always asking too many questions. This free verse poem articulates how the young woman's mother cooked in India and how in Canada she has to learn to cook on a stove, buying one from her Japanese neighbor. And the poem reads like this. India, a chalwar, a tandoor she made herself, molded clay, it fired slow, in her veins eons of knowing how to cook this way, she was sure. Queensborough, an ironwood stove with a door, a shelf, an oven, and a porcelain decoration. When the Japanese, under pressure before internment, and desperate for cash, sold everything on the boardwalk, she bought a white enamel stove from her Japanese neighbor. The stove moved to the kitchen by the Fraser River site. The white enamel polished, bright as memory, black-edged with fear of being transported like the Japanese, entering her life too, like Ito's. The stove in the kitchen cooked Indian rice, colored saffron for my brother's birthdays, Japanese interned, forgotten, aliens. Until in walked Helen, red hair, caring, taught Mama everything about living here. Mama learned from her to bake two egg white cakes in wax paper lined tins, with peel granite from Ito's Japanese oranges in butter icing. Gill names the Japanese women and reclaims how women work together to create a life in Canada. In this poem lingers with fear about white Canada sweeping into the kitchens of these women and transporting them to internment camps. Gill writes down the fears for us to remember and to reflect on how women have had to connect in domestic spaces like the kitchen. The until in the last stanza implies a before, and Helen's ethnicity is not explicitly revealed other than through her red hair. The here is Canada. The poem is rich with connections between women, and Gill captures how the women intervene and support each other. Yet the relationship between Gill's mother, Helen, and Ido are complex, and there is a hierarchy of who is Canadian and who is not. Gill's mother is a new immigrant who is having Canadian culture imposed upon her by Helen, even as Helen teaches her to cook in her new home. Ido's internment causes Gill's mother and Gill to fear her own displacement. And I read this in the lines, Japanese interned, forgotten aliens. Even though Gill's mother is not physically displaced, the internment of Ido and her family teaches a lesson to Gill's mother and the daughter. And the lesson is that they must learn this imposed culture, or else they will be forgotten aliens. Gill's mother benefits from Ido's internment, even as she aids Ido in buying her stove. Gill's mother's memory of Ido is not forgotten. From the second to the last stanza, Gill repeats Japanese. From the Japanese neighbor in the second stanza, the stove in the third stanza, which becomes a metaphor for the Japanese interned. And in the final stanza, Ido/Japanese oranges. Gill does not allow us, the reader, to forget Ido. In this one poem, Gill has done what Mukherjee demands, that is, quote, all learning must start with learning about one's own background. It must not stop there, but to go on to include one's fellow beings, end quote. It is within these poems that we read how women's writing attempts to dismantle the hierarchy of who is Canadian through showing the links between women. When we read the next poem, The Old Abbotsford Temple, the child's inquiry about the pictures, Gill visually captures the now 100-year-old, well, it's more than 100 years old, Guru Sikh Gurdwara in Abbotsford from the first generation girl child's perspective, skillfully connecting traditions and symbols from the Sikh faith. And the poem reads, the first stanza, a two-story temple, stairs rising from the street sidewalk, where we stand for the Khalsa photographs. 4 doors, we are casteless. We enter from the north, south, east, and west. Out of carpeted floors, a raised base, overlaid with sumptuous cloth, tapestries of gold, silver, embroidered jewels to enfold the holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib. In the above photo, we can picture how the Guru Granth Sahib is located within the Abbotsford Temple, and how for a child the space is magical with tapestries of gold, silver, embroideries. The Sikh's idea of casteless is also stated in this poem. However, the image of being welcomed into the space is jarred in the second stanza. And the second stanza reads, pictures line the walls, haunt children and frighten me. How did the Gurus walk like this? Headless, spouting blood from an open neck. He holds a kirpan in one hand, his own head in the other. He walks. The child's queries about the violent pictures are troublesome, not only to the child but also to the reader, because there are more questions than answers. The image is of one of the 10 gurus, but Gill does not explain the picture's background. When the child asks in the third line, did our gurus walk like this? Gill uses the pronoun our to indicate that the child is aware that she is part of this religious community. However, the child does not understand and is never told why the guru walks like this, nor is she given any answers to her questions. From the poem, it could be read that the guru has cut off his own head and is walking, but again, we are left with additional questions. The poem indicates that the guru is holding a kirpan, one of the 5 Ks, and I'm making an assumption that the kirpan is unsheathed, but her questions are important in the context of bringing the Sikh religion into the center and making Sikhs accountable for their beliefs. In the next stanza, a series of questions. Again, do our temples shine like that? The gold domes? Is it real? Is it real gold? Where did it come from? Who climbed up there? Who climbed up there? Who climbed up there? And was it poured on, laid on, poured on? What about that pond? Who swims there? Where are the swans? From the first line to the last, none of the child's questions are ever answered. The pictures of the Golden Temple in India are surrounded by water, and it's structured, of course, differently from the Abbotsford Gurdwara. From the questions about the pictures of the Golden Temple, it can be read that for the Sikh child being raised in Canada, the Golden Temple is somewhat empty of its meaning. Here I have to acknowledge how Gill crafts questions within the poem and does not attempt to answer them. Instead, the work is left for the readers to do. It is the innocence of the questions that compels an answer, but Gill is crafting a diasporic identity here, a subject position that starts early, at an early age. The child again is drawn to the pictures and asks again. This is, I believe, the fourth stanza. Who lit the aura around the Guru Nanak's head? Will I see that kind of man, white beard, cleared-eyed, holding a falcon in India, in our village, in the world? Why then there? Why then not here? This poem speaks directly to the stories I was told about Guru Nanak and how he believed God was everywhere. When the child asks, but why then not here? The here is Canada, and the child is asking a key question that addresses the formation of the faith. The girl child is in process of creating a diasporic identity that is being produced through questions. When she asks, in our village, it is the question mark that is read here, in the structure of the poem. The girl child has seen India, and she understands that she's not to see Canada as home, but rather as a new kind of identity being formed for her. In the last stanza, Gill cleverly directs the reader back to Canada through history. Who is that man lying on the railroad tracks? The Komagata Maru man, martyred, wrapped in white winding sheets, asleep, the thread of his life, like railroad ties across the country, runs through all of us, like a dream in the blood. Gill dovetails religion and racism in Canadian history, but she manages to tie us all together through a dream in the blood. In the last poem, The Old Abbotsford Temple, a young woman reflects on the Bogue. The young woman's voice is describing a temple ceremony within the Gurdwara. In this poem, Gill provides us with a narrative that addresses and describes the importance of women. She describes how Sikh women's work is foundational to keeping the community together. The first three verses require that the reader knows something of the religious elements, such as sitting on the floor, and that there's a man's side and a woman's side. In this descriptive poem, the young woman's voice explains her surroundings within the first four stanzas. I hear the grunt, and the poem reads, I hear the grunty, recite the prayer, read from Guru Granth Sahib. A man gracefully waves a long white-haired whisk. Impure flies must not touch the holy book. The rhythm of his waving arm, a voice reading, the reciting crowd puts me to sleep. I sit on the floor in the midst of women. We shift our weight from cheek to cheek, lean against the wall. Friends lean back against our knees. Old ladies balance holding our shoulders as they pass to sit with family or friends in the throng. Unknowing children grasp at shawls, fall into strangers' laps, and turn us black and blue when they hit our heads with theirs. We smile, suffer the little children. As they cry for prashad, mother shoos them across the room to the men's side. In the langar below, nannies, mothers, aunts, mother-in-laws, and other women boil the cha, knead the dough, roll the rotis, stir the rice, egg on one another, take a turn, peel the onions, soak the tamarind, wash the mint, dice the potatoes, squeeze the lemons. The old aunts say, don't ask the new daughter-in-laws. unmarried girls about to be brides to do this. Then let it all go to our old eyes, and when they wipe away the sting of spice, dry their old aware eyes, women share stories, whisper tears, agonies, and laughter. Here we read how the Guru Granth Sahib becomes a key element in the religion and must be kept pure and clean. The impure flies must be kept away. This tradition of waving a long white-haired whisk is something that continues today in the Gurdwaras. The women are not included in the religious service. Rather, Gill writes how hypnotic the male Granthi's priest tone is and how it puts her to sleep. I read that the women are disinterested in the religious ceremony and are passively listening to the male Granthi, while at the same time they are taking care of the children until, quote, mothers shoo them across the room to the men's side. We could also read that women fall asleep because they've been working hard in the Langar Hall below. The separation between men and women is also very telling. The separation forces the young women to learn to connect with women around them, and especially within the kitchen. I read the old aunts saying that they do not want to work with unmarried girls about to be brides, not because they do not want to teach them to cook, but because rather their old aware eyes know that these young girls have a lifetime of work ahead of them. The older aunts are exercising their agency in protecting these young women from the sting of the onions and spices. It can be read metaphorically as protecting them and undermining the patriarchal social order. When these women are cooking with each other, they are sharing stories, whispering tears, agonies, and laughter, and they create a strong, connected women's community. The segregation of women in kitchens keeps them from power and authority on one level, but the segregation allows them for bonding and agency and empowerment. All these family stories were spoken but not written up until Gill's poetry. These women are connecting with each other in the Langar halls rather than passively sitting and listening to the prayers in spaces that have become more religious and masculine. As we continue reading, Gill does not let Sikh women off the hook for their gossiping. Sikh women's gossip can be a source of division and lead to power struggles, but through the gossip, Gilbert is reminding us, the reader, that these women carry with them to Canada notions of honor and pride, as well as cultural and religious divisions. And the gossips are added. The mother agonizes. So which 5 minutes is that? Okay. And see, I thought that I was going to be under. Okay. So the poem reads, and the gossips are at it, and a mother agonizes. We fought at independence. Her aunts barely made it home alive. Now she thinks it's all right to marry and even go to their side in Pakistan to visit. The mother who agonizes is lamenting how her daughter has betrayed the community and is marrying a man from Pakistan. As readers, we infer that the groom must be Muslim. The Sangat, the Sikh congregation, is being led by male Granthis, and again, the young woman explains that she does not understand the religious script, which would connect to earlier lines when the one woman is falling asleep. I can't understand the word the Granthi chants. The language is all Gurmukhi mixed with Urdu poets, Hindi, and maybe even Sanskrit and Pali prose. No one explains, perhaps few even know. I say the prayer Waheguru and hold 2 hands out for prasad. The poem suggests that Sikhism has shrunk into a phrase like Waheguru for the young women and for the entire congregation. The lack of understanding of the religious script connects to the earlier lines about falling asleep in the Gurdwara. There's a lack of enthusiasm and knowledge about what goes on in the temple that is shown in the lines no one explains, perhaps few even know. Certainly the only person that might understand is the Granthi. However, the diaspora community does not fully engage with the religious scriptures. When the young woman reaches out for prasad, which Gill defines as sanctified food in a blessing, the poem ends and we as readers are left with questions rather than answers. Personally, as a child, I would fall asleep because of my own disinterest and, more importantly, lack of knowledge of what was going on in front of me. It is the lack of knowledge that links these poems in this section. From the mother in the first poem who learned to live in Canada from the red-haired Helen to the young child in the second poem who has nothing but questions about the religious pictures, to the young woman in the third poem who is disinterested and cannot stay awake during the religious rituals. When read together, the subject position of the young woman in the third poem appears to be tense. She's kept somewhat away from the kitchen, and she does not understand the Granger's chants. Yet, she's still part of the community, and because it's situated in Abbotsford, she understands that Canada is now home. So just because of time, and I promised Doris I would read a poem or two from Seva. For me, Gil is one of those writers who started writing and publishing in Canada in English, in a language that was easily understandable, and for me anyway. And she mixes in Punjabi words, and this is a tradition that has really has been going on since the early 70s with South Asian women writing. And there's Shakti's Words, which is an anthology of South Asian Canadian women poets. There's Red Silk, which is also another. And these are all anthologies written by Sikh women or written by women of color, South Asian women, and writing in English and trying to, well, not trying, but they are committing to telling the stories of their families. So I know that it might seem a little bit, I'm going to sort of jump, but so when Kuldeep Gill passed away in 2009, I was very shocked because I thought, oh, well, these people will live on, right? And you think, oh, they're going to be here and we'll be able to have dialogues with them, but of course that's not true. So I remember Gil saying to me over the phone once, well, you need to start writing. You need to start putting it out there. And I know Shauna has said that to me many times before. And so I started sending out this poetry book that I was calling Seva, and it finally got published. So I'm going to read just one poem, I think, from here, and it's Educated Family, and then I will stop, because I think I've run out of time, haven't I? Educated Family. And for those of you who don't know, Seva means selfless service. Because your sons, my mamajis, did not think it was important for you to have an obituary, Nanaji. At the age of 86, or is it 90, you wanted to be like your granddaughters. In an arranged marriage, 70 years long, you never thought yourself alone. With a husband beside you, you did not worry about signing rent checks or addressing letters. Once again, our mom said not to waste time teaching an old woman new tricks. But we granddaughters understood your fear and disobeyed our mothers again. A doctor and a pharmacist consulted about your medication. A chef prepares jha with full fat milk and 2 tablespoons of sugar. A teacher finds a pen and a paper. Bookend by Harpreet and Navjot, Amritpal places a cup of cha in front of you. We encourage courage. Surrounded by professional granddaughters, you picked up the pen and then paper. You wrote your name in Punjabi, then English. The encore, Manku. Thank you.